The history of teaching American history in the classroom. So we start with the early colonial period. In the colonial period, which was from the founding of Jamestown until 1776, here education was largely informal. It was not something where children left their homes for 8 hours a day and came back like it is today. It was very informal. Some kids received no education outside the home, and others had private tutors. The focus of this education was mostly on religious instruction and on the teaching of local history, history of your colony. For example, even the Ivy League universities we know so well, Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Princeton, they were all started as seminaries, tended to be for religious instruction primarily, and the teaching of local history secondarily. Early American education was mostly the responsibility of churches because pastors were seen as the most educated people in town, and then also of private tutors. You had itinerant schoolmasters who would travel from town to town. Therefore, there was no uniform curriculum or standards that all institutions of learning followed. However, the history of one's colony was seen as very valuable so that the learner could become a moral and a productive member of that colony. Then, after the American Revolution in the late 1700s, the need for a unified national identity led to the encouragement of a more structured curriculum across the 13 states. Often, this curriculum emphasized the nation's founding ideals, things like liberty and democracy, and that all men are created equal. And the goal of history teachers at this time was to create American citizens who understood the nation's founding values, understood where they came from, and also understood their own responsibilities in preserving American society. Then, as we get into the 19th century, this saw the rise of public education as we know it, and American history became more formally included in a lot of school curricula, often presented as a very patriotic narrative. The goal here was to make young citizens love their country by learning about its accomplishments, learning about its values, and also discerning your own part in America's exceptional place in the world. In the mid-19th century, you have textbooks like The History of the United States by George Bancroft, really helping to shape the standardized narrative of American history. And the focus was on progress, how we're always getting better. The focus was on national unity, how we're one nation, not a bunch of different states on their own. And also the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that America is different in a good way and is an exceptional country and has a special place in God's plan. During the Civil War and Reconstruction periods, history education became much more polarized. For example, in the North, it remained as George Bancroft had it, exceptionalism in the U.S. In the South, you start to have a trend called the Lost Cause narrative, which talked about how the South was right and the Civil War wasn't really about slavery and all sorts of kind of revisionist history in that way. But then as the late 19th and early 20th centuries came about, history instruction started to focus more and more on assimilating immigrant children, children from places like Italy and Russia and Mexico and China, assimilating them into American society, teaching them the values, teaching them the ways of the majority culture in American history. And then finally, why is U.S. history still required in schools? Well, U.S. history curricula have become much more uniform and much more standardized. You have standardized testing really increasing over the past 25 years, especially with the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001 and continuing with Common Core in 2009. States are largely responsible for creating their own social studies requirements. There are not very many national standards as far as social studies is concerned. But 46 states legally require U.S. history to be taught to high schoolers and require them to pass that in order to graduate. There are only 4 states today, including Illinois, that do not require U.S. history anymore. And I think the reason why U.S. history is still required by much of the country is because when people know their history, they're better informed citizens. And the only way a republic works is if you have an informed populace. And requiring U.S. history is one way to attempt to bring that about. Having a populace who respects their nation's leaders, are less likely to repeat the mistakes of the past, better understand who they are and their responsibilities in making America work. All of that is attempted to be brought about with the teaching of U.S. history in high school.